I noticed in our education system, the core assumption made about the world in which we enter into a classroom is that in that space, we enter into it as an individual, and that the primary thing that's acting in that space is the individual. Alternatively, we could think of the primary thing, because in ecology, the primary thing, and it's really important, I think, to think about when we talk about ecology, because even the way ecology is taught in our schools doesn't acknowledge this. What we don't do a lot of the time, or at least we don't do enough, is we don't shift from saying the primary thing in ecology is the relationship. It's the space in between the things in there, right? That's where the action is. And in a classroom, that's where the learning is. So if we talk about ecology as a concept, like as a concept that is separate from us, and we talk about ecology while enacting these relationships in a classroom in a very individualistic way, we're not actually doing it in an ecological way.
Welcome to the Journey of the Universe 10 Years Later podcast. My name is Sam King, and today I'm joined by Theodore Richards. Dr. Richards is an educator, writer, and philosopher. He's the founder of the Chicago Wisdom Project, now Wisdom Projects, Inc., and editor of the online magazine and podcast Reimagining. His work is dedicated to reimagining education and creating new narratives about our place in the world. He has received numerous degrees from various institutions, including the University of Chicago and the California Institute of Integral Studies, but has learned just as much studying the martial art of Bagua, teaching in various settings to different students, and as a traveler from the Far East to the Middle East, from Southern Africa to the South Pacific. He is the author of 8 books, receiving numerous literary awards, including 2 Nautilus Book Awards and 3 Independent Publisher Awards. His next book, Reimagining the Classroom, is scheduled for publication in December of 2022. He lives on the south side of Chicago with his wife and 3 daughters. Theodore, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Sam, for having me.
So I loved reading the manuscript of your forthcoming book, and I share so many of the passions that you brought forth about the intersection of ecology, cosmology, and education. And so much of your book revolves around the question of story. And to begin, I'm curious to hear a little bit more about your own origin story and what influences inspired you to write this book.
Yeah, thank you for that, Sam. I would say that I have a lot of stories that I could share, and there's a few. I mean, really, like kind of if we expand it out and think of like the biggest kind of story for me, that sort of the thread that sort of weaves through everything in my life. I think of my very young childhood, and I think in our conversation we'll talk about cosmology and loneliness a little bit, and I remember being a very small child and being fascinated with space, and at the same time looking out my window and pondering the vastness and emptiness of the cosmos. And it took me a long time, like many years later, to reflect back on that and realize that I had a fairly lonely childhood, felt really alone a lot of the time. And that was a function of a lot of different things probably, but partly it had less to do with kind of like my philosophical speculation about the universe than it did about kind of the culture that we collectively put together, and how often we don't feel a sense of connection and relationship. Moving forward a little bit, it's kind of like what influenced me more specifically about the book. I went to high school in where I grew up in Rochester, New York, and we talked a little bit about this offline. I went to a large urban high school, and sort of pedagogically, it couldn't have been further away from kind of some of the ideas we talked about. And I reflect back on how the school was internally segregated. It had this kind of conveyor belt in which bells rang and students were moved like in an assembly line from class to class. And that was sort of like the negative side of it. But the positive side was it really actually opened me up. I met a lot of different people from all over the world and was exposed to like people across socioeconomic and cultural lines. And that really sort of like got me to think outside of the box, out of the neighborhood that I was from. So that was a big influence on me. And then I went off to the University of Chicago, which couldn't possibly have been more different academically from where I went to high school. And I learned a lot intellectually from being in Chicago, but actually what I learned the most, I would say, well, I think first of all, I learned what was absent. And I remember sitting in seminars and thinking, everyone's having an emotional response to this text. And what we're required to do now is to push down those emotional responses and reframe them in a more intellectual way, right? And repress any kind of feelings that we might have about what we're talking about in the discussion, and not address any of those embodied or emotional elements to our response to what we're talking about, you know? And then I happened to meet a woman by the name of Sue Duncan, who ran an after-school program on the south side of Chicago. And for many years, I worked with her and began to become interested in education and how someone who is from an advantaged background is given the opportunity to think creatively, is given the opportunity to explore their world, is given kind of like all these tools to examine oneself, and is ask questions. And then the students that we worked with on the south side of Chicago seldom were asked questions about who they were, seldom were given this kind of sense of agency. The idea was that they needed more discipline rather than more creativity in their lives. And that felt extraordinarily wrong, you know, to me. And from there, I traveled the world and eventually started the Chicago Wisdom Project, which we can talk more about. But really, the origins of this book for me came about during the pandemic when I was homeschooling my children. I was homeschooling my two youngest children, but my oldest child, who was 13 at the time, she was doing remote learning in Chicago Public School. And I can remember we took our whole family to Miami from Chicago to do homeschooling there, where the weather was warmer, we could at least get outside. And I remember that news came from Chicago that a 13-year-old boy was shot and killed in an alley. And his name was Adam Toledo. And as the story unfolded, it became what the narrative, the public discourse centered on the fact that someone at some point, the police had killed this boy, and someone at some point had given this child a gun. And although he didn't have it when he was shot, the story that unfolded was that he was shot because he had a gun and he ran away from the police. And it made me think a lot about my own child, who, just like him, was a Chicago public school student, a 13-year-old. And this notion of having a gun been put in the child's hand made me think a lot about asking myself, what is it I have put, not literally, but metaphorically, what have I put in my child's hand? And it made me think, was Adam shot because of the thing in his hand, or because there was a story that was unfolding that thing symbolized? In other words, he wasn't just given a gun, he was given a story about who he was, about his place in the world, about power and agency, and about whether or not he was valued as a human being. And I thought to myself, this is exactly what we're all doing with our children. Whether we know it or not, we're giving them a story. We're giving them something to hold in their hand that symbolizes who they are and their place in the world. And it made me ask, what is it that I'm giving my own children? And that was kind of the origin of writing this book.
Thank you so much for sharing some of your own personal story and that really sobering note about Adam. I think it would be helpful for viewers to hear a little bit more about the Chicago Wisdom Project before we delve into the book, because so much of your reflections in the book draw on your firsthand experience working with inner city youth in Chicago. And I know that project later expanded to Baltimore. So would love to hear a little bit more about the vision and work behind Wisdom Projects.
Yeah, sure. So, and I like to think of the work that I do and that we do at Wisdom Projects Incorporated as kind of like, you know, the ideas, the philosophy, the creation of the whole program as being rooted in actual, like, kind of on the ground, getting your hands dirty work. Like these are ideas that have been formulated both through, like reading and talking and discussing with people like you, but also, just kind of like practice, getting out in the world and doing the work. And I think that's where good philosophy comes from, good teaching comes from as well, right? And so I started the Chicago Wisdom Project in 2009 when I moved back from California with my family, and I'd been working with Matthew Fox, a theologian and an educator, and Matt was one of my teachers when I was in graduate school in California, and he had hired me to run an after-school program when to start. He'd run this holistic program for graduate students, but he thought, like, we need to do this for teenagers right here in Oakland, where I was living. And this was like right in the time when there was a big push with this so-called reform movement in schools, where high stakes testing was sort of central, and there was a huge focus on getting these test scores up, and with things like no Child Left Behind, or Race to the Top, this notion that we needed to get more competition in the schools among students and among students and among schools in order to, like, uplift the overall kind of educational outcomes. And what this did was it created like this radically reductionist notion of what it meant to be educated. And we were thinking, like, well, we need to do something that's more holistic. And it's just like my early reflections when I was in college and thereafter about why is it that when we treat children who are Black and brown or from lower socioeconomic classes, why do we not give them the opportunity to have a sense of creativity or agency or holistic approach? Why do we think that they just need more discipline? And so we did this program for a few years in Oakland, and then I moved back to Chicago. We had one child at the time. My wife is from Chicago and wanted to come back home, so we came back here. And I kind of looked around, and it was like, there weren't a lot of jobs for, like, philosopher poets or whatever, on Craigslist. So I actually created a nonprofit and started to teach through that nonprofit. We ran community gardens. We eventually bought land in Michigan and ran retreats and summer camps for kids. We did after school programs. We created curriculum and content too. We do a lot of stuff, as far as like furthering the conversation about what it means to be an educated person, and eventually merged with a program in Baltimore called the Baltimore Wisdom Project. And now we run programs in Baltimore as well.
So inspiring, and especially to think about the honoring and nurturing the interiority, the creativity of kids from these marginalized backgrounds. And, it comes back to, as you were saying earlier, this question of story and what are the stories that we're conveying to our youth and empowering them to create for themselves. And I wanted to circle back to the beginning of the book, where you really foreground this idea of the cosmology of loneliness. And with the Journey of the Universe project, we think a lot about cosmology, about the stories we tell about our place in the earth and in the universe. And so, you have this poignant description of a lone child staring at a screen in the heart of the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm curious to hear, what is the cosmology of loneliness for you? And then how does ecology emerge as kind of an alternative for reimagining the classroom?
Yeah. Like, so that image is a real image for me. I watched my daughter who did it every day. My oldest daughter who was doing remote learning each day. And it didn't work very well for her. It was really, really hard on her emotionally to sit there and stare at a screen every day. It wasn't because the teachers weren't doing a good job or weren't trying hard or anything like that. It was just that what I noticed was like things like, and the pandemic was just hard in a lot of ways, right? There was in some ways we had to choose between a variety of bad options, right? In the case of, in this case, what I noticed though was like was that there was this kind of inertia that happens when you have these patterns, right? These patterns, that the ways of doing things that we're accustomed to, and there's no better example of that than kind of our educational system, right? We have a pattern that we're accustomed to, and we do it because we're so used to doing it. We do it because we have a worldview, a world vision, or a cosmology that teaches us kind of like what our core values are and who we are and how things ought to be. And by nature, it's not something that we think about normally. So by nature, it's something that's so woven into the culture and into our kind of like day-to-day patterns that we don't think about it a lot. And I think that when I talk about the cosmology of loneliness, it's kind of the taking the radical individualism of a hyper capitalist society to the extreme. And when we talk about freedom so much in American society, that's like kind of like this word we hear all the time is freedom. And often when taken to the radical extreme, freedom really results in loneliness. It's freedom from responsibility for each other a lot of time. It's freedom from community and things like that. And so I noticed in our education system, the sort of like the core value is or the core assumption made about the world that in which we enter into a classroom. And I'm thinking of a classroom now as a symbolic space, not just a physical space, but a symbolic space in which these interactions happen and in which learning happens. And the core assumption is that in that space, we enter into it as an individual, and that the primary thing that's acting in that space is the individual. Alternatively, you mentioned ecology. So alternatively, we could think of the primary thing, because in ecology, the primary thing, and it's really important, I think, to think about when we talk about ecology, because even the way ecology is taught in our schools doesn't acknowledge this. Even when we're saying like, this is going to be a class about ecology, what we don't do a lot of the time, or at least don't do enough, is we don't shift from saying the primary thing in ecology is the relationship. It's the space in between the things in there, right? That's where the action is. And in a classroom, that's where the learning is. So if we talk about ecology as a concept, like as a concept that is separate from us, and we talk about ecology while enacting these relationships in a classroom on a very individualistic way, we're not actually doing it in an ecological way. We're not actually shifting the paradigm to an ecological sensibility, because the ecological sensibility is that what's primary is relationship. It's actually, and this is like, I think we have to understand too, that this is like this hyper individualism that I'm talking about that's resulted in this loneliness is actually a shift from most human culture through most of human history. I draw from Buddhism a lot when I'm talking about this, because I think Buddhism really is a wonderful kind of way, has a wonderful way of sort of like describing the primacy of relationship. But really, we can't talk about ecology, we can't talk about evolution, we can't talk about most subjects without understanding that what's primary is relationship. And we can't talk about education, we can't talk about what's actually happening in the classroom without understanding that the real core of it, if we're going to try to figure out how to have a better classroom or a better learning experience for our children, we have to understand that the thing that needs to be repaired, to be mended, and this is the core principle of restorative practices and restorative justice, is the core thing that's being repaired is not the individual wound, but it's the relationship. And the core thing that's actually happening when you're learning in a classroom is not the individual achievement level. That's the wrong thing to focus. It's the relationship. And I think that's what an ecological sensibility will teach us.
Absolutely. And such a paradigm shift in so many educational structures. I think about the US Department of Education's mission statement to prepare learners to be competitors in a global marketplace, for instance. Just so much privileging the individual, and this, high stakes testing, the idea of just individual achievement. And I love the way you're using ecology as a way of reimagining not just the content of what students are learning, but the very methods, the structure of learning environments themselves.
Yeah, I mean, that notion that the purpose of education is to, and I think a lot of the time, and actually like one of the things I really started with when we started Chicago Wisdom Project was like this idea of like, maybe we ought to ask ourselves, at least ask, right, what the purpose of education is. because there's so many assumptions that the purpose is to, like, some version of what you just described, like some version of, like, be competitive in the global marketplace, like in other words, like get a better job, make more money, whatever, something like that, right? Get more A's, something like that, right? I mean, I think we ought to think more deeply about it, for one, at least ask the question, have a conversation. Is that really the point of education, right? So, and that mission that you described, being competitive in the global marketplace, it's problematic on multiple levels. Like, it's problematic, first of all, because it simply is a poor way to motivate a child, for one. I think, like we tell 5-year-olds, you have to do better in your tests so you get a better job. I mean, that's not developmentally appropriate. It's also pointless because we don't know what this global economy is going to look like by the time that 5-year-old is ready to go in the workplace. We have no idea what the future holds. And what it's really not doing, we know it's not doing, it may or may not prepare them for the imaginary job that we think they might have at some point. But we know it's not doing is it's not preparing them to think creatively and radically and critically about their world, a world that's changing in ways that we simply cannot predict. And so it's not teaching them how to cope with that intellectually, emotionally, or in any other way. So I think, yeah, this is a huge mistake to go down that road.
I so appreciate the different lineages you're weaving together to be thinking about education holistically. That poignant anecdote you shared about your experience at the University of Chicago, which I can relate to, having emotional responses to the ideas you're learning, but somehow having to bracket our affective selves and make everything into a kind of rationalistic, hyper intellectualized activity, and not allow our whole humanity to really enter into learning spaces. And you mentioned some of the lineages you draw from, creation, spirituality. You mentioned your work with Matthew Fox. You also draw on multiple intelligence theory through Howard Gardner and Ken Wilber's integral theory. I'm curious to hear a little bit more about how these lineages of holistic education inform your work.
Yeah, and there are a lot of different ways to think about that, right? To think about holistic education. I mean, I think the work I did with Matt, like, really, I think the thing that Matt taught me the most through creation and spirituality was this notion that we ought to be cultivating awe and wonder. And the real work happens when we are looking critically at the story we have and using our creative minds, our creativity, through art to reimagine that story. And that was kind of the core of the work we did in Oakland, and it's continued to be that idea. And and Matt worked with people like Brian Swim and Thomas Berry, who also influenced me a lot. So that kind of thinking, the idea that the point of education ought to be to look at the story, critique the story, reimagine the story, and use our creativity to come up with a new story. And then the other people you mentioned, integral theory and multiple intelligence theory, which are just different frames to think more holistically. And I think this is just really thinking holistically about. And I'll say, I don't need to go through kind of all the details of each of those things because they're really complex, but I'd like to say that when we're thinking holistically, it's really important to think of it not just in terms of kind of like body, mind, spirit for the individual. That is important, and we've always done that. But let's think about it also in terms of the individual as also part of a larger whole, right? So the individual isn't just, I have my personal self, but I also have my family, my community, my society, my world. So I am not just an isolated individual. I have, like, sort of just like a mandala, expanding selves from microcosm to macrocosm, and thinking about the individual that way. Think about the learner that way. If we're talking about someone who's a student in a school, let's not reduce that person just their individual self. If we're really, really taking seriously holistic thinking. And then, and I think also I'd like to, the kind of inner and outer part, which partly we get to when we talk about, kind of like body, mind, self. But I think we just think of everything, everyone and everything as having an interiority, which you mentioned before. I think that's a really healthy and helpful way of thinking about what it means to be an individual in a classroom, but also, like, let's think about the classroom itself as having an interiority. It's not just a physical space, but it also has an interiority. There's an emotional side to the entire process, to everything that's there. And it carries a symbolic weight. Like I talked about the gun in Adam Toledo's hand. That gun had an interiority, which is the story that it told about the person who gave it to him and what it meant, right? So what's the story behind, what's the emotion behind that object, and talking through anything that happens. And that's the piece that was missing that I described being in a college seminar, which you said you could relate to, that in the interiority, not just of myself, but also of what's happening in the conversation about the world.
I can see, echoes of Brian Swin and Thomas Berry, this idea that reality has an interiority, that we all have an inner component within us, and we see this interiority, this intelligence throughout the more than human world as well.
Yeah. Teilhard, I think Teilhard influences them in that way.
Absolutely, Teilhard de Chardin. And Theodore, in building out this holistic vision of education, you organize chapters in terms of cosmos, arts, spirit, hands, and justice and joy, which I thought was a really interesting way of approaching these different lenses, whether it's studying mathematics or studying literature or the humanities. I'm curious to hear how that sort of structure came about for you.
Well, partly, and this will sound like a little bit of a, I don't know, cop-out answer, but like partly because you got to have chapters if you're going to write a book. So, and like, just like if you're going to like, and I think people feel this way, like if they're going to start a school, they got to have subjects, right? So, and the assumption is that you ought to have like English and social studies and math and foreign language or whatever it is you have, right? And they're generally conceived of in silos and separate from one another. So I would start by saying I think that we ought to really think about how in a much more integrated way, and about how we can not have those things be siloed. I think that's really important to think about how different subject matter can sort of overlap and intersect. So what I tried to do was create a holistic process through which all of those different subjects were woven, and that they could like sort of intersect and weave within each other in each chapter. And as far as like what I chose, I tried to be really creative about thinking differently. And this is one way to kind of organize a curriculum. And what I offered to the reader is kind of like a way to think creatively about what's being taught. So, I started with, and these aren't in any particular order, but the idea of cosmos, the idea was like, I think that the way we ought to teach science and math should put cosmology as primary. The overriding narrative of the story of the universe should be woven, and this can be woven through everything else too, like in all different subject matter. But if we're talking about science, that should be primary. Like my oldest daughter is in high school now, and she's taking chemistry. And I think it's going fine, but I have to be honest, like, I don't think she knows what chemistry is. Like in other words, she does not know where these elements come from, why they matter, what the point of it. Like, I don't think that's been shared with her at all. She's learning it to learn it as a subject and to be able to take a test in that subject. That's how they're teaching it. And that's not unusual. And it's not an indicator of generally how our classes go, but I think in science, sometimes students don't have broader context for what they're learning. And I think that's really very, very important. So that's the subject of cosmos. And also I think ecology and rooting it in our local ecology too, I would add, is really important, and sort of like hands-on work, and then the arts is like, and I include, when I say the arts, I'll just make a note about that. A lot of people think they know what the arts are, and that's, standard. I think literature should be taught as an art, not merely. All art has a technical component, right? We have to learn how to hold a paintbrush or use the pottery wheel. But and literature absolutely has that. As a writer, one has to learn certain technique, but it's an art as well. And I think that we ought to teach literature as an art, just like we teach, it should not be separate from the way we teach, say, like the plastic arts, for example. The subject of spirit has to do with our inner life. And that's where we get to the interiority of things that we talked about, right? Like everything has an interiority. It's also about learning the great wisdom traditions and how they might relate to questions we have, big questions we have about our lives, you know. The what is it? Hands is about just hands-on learning, and also work, meaningful work in the world. I kind of borrow from the Montessori tradition, which has this phrase of, it talks about work, doing work. Practical life is the phrase that they use for like doing daily work in the world, cleaning, cooking, fixing things, repairing things. That's all really, really important for a child to learn how to do. And there are many, many lessons in that. And then justice and joy, I also have the sort of subtitle of social emotional justice. And so I sort of try to integrate social emotional learning with social justice. And I think the way that we teach social justice is, of course, by learning about the world and the issues that are at stake, but also in the relationships in the classroom. How do we contend with conflicts, both small and large, that happen among students, and how do we navigate social relationships and emotional challenges that happen? How do we navigate those? That's how you teach a person to be more compassionate and to engage the broader world. Too often, social justice educators jump right into the protest, jump right into the issue without actually creating again, the primacy of relationship is really important. Creating relationships that are rooted in justice and in those kind of, and that's why restorative practices are so important, not just as like when it's a conflict, but as like a central kind of like guiding principle throughout the curriculum.
Absolutely, yeah. The way you bring this liberatory lens to all these different subjects, I find so powerful. And you continually refer back to this idea that the classroom is a metaphor for the world, and that students in learning environments are participating in a process of world making, that they're actually creating new narratives, they're creating new worlds through what they're studying. And I know in my own teaching and educational training, there's a lot of talk about backwards design pedagogy, of sort of knowing my hoped learning outcomes and building toward there from the beginning of a class. And I'm intrigued by this approach of not necessarily knowing where we are going, or allowing students to co-create where the world that they are building in the classroom. And I'm curious to hear how you think educators can nurture this sense of world making among students.
Yeah, I mean, it's easier said than done for sure. I mean, but I'll say the central idea of the book is what you just described, which is a classroom. And a classroom is, when I'm talking about a classroom, I'm not talking necessarily about a room inside of a school. What I'm talking about is a classroom as a learning space is a metaphor for the world, and in any context, whether it's at home, whether it's in an after-school program, whether it's at a summer camp, whether it's at a kung fu dojo, wherever it is, whether it's at a church, wherever you are, if you're learning what you're doing without knowing it, or whether you know it or not, you are providing a metaphor for the world, or a microcosm for the macrocosm of the world. And that's the most fundamental thing that's being taught, is the processes and is the cultivation and the formation of that space and the subtle kind of metaphors. That's where the cosmology is played out, right? So if your core values about the world are competition and individualism, then you're going to create a space in which those values are primary. And I'll just give you like an obvious example of this is like, if I line the desks up in rows and put myself up in the front as the teacher, I've given a subtle or not so subtle message to the students about who's in power, who has the knowledge, and about agency, and about what it means to be educated and be in power. If I make a circle and everyone can see each other, and I might be an authority in some sense because I'm maybe older and I've studied this subject, but if I begin with asking questions and listening, and inquiring, then I've taught a different kind of lesson about the world there. And you notice I haven't said anything about content, right? I have not said anything about like a lesson about, geopolitics or about colonialism or anything like that. I'm simply describing a space and processes therein. And so the classroom itself, this is where the message is. And this is a very kind of Freirean, from the work of Paulo Freire, very Freirean concept, this notion that if no matter how much like kind of content we teach to someone who's coming, but this is particularly true, and this is how Freire was writing, and this is a lot of my own work. If we're talking about individuals who have been colonized or are in sort of less empowered contexts, if no matter how much information I convey, if the subtle message is that I have the power and that their only work is to access my power, rather than give them the agency and power to think for themselves, then I've only reinforced this kind of like power relationship. And I think the other thing that happens is, and I think this is, I want to say that this is not only done with sort of bad intentions. This is done in very subtle ways. And it's really hard. Like as a parent of 3 children, one of the hardest things to do is to like let your child go out and make choices for herself. It's really, really hard to do, to like let go of that need to kind of control and need to care for. It comes from a place of care and also fear, because it's scary, and let's be honest, like teachers go into a classroom and they have like a whole bunch of kids there, and it's scary to say, I'm gonna let go of some of my need to control here, some of my power, and allow the students to make some choices. Especially when you have like kind of like the bureaucracy breathing down your neck and saying, you have to get these test scores up. That's one of the sort of like real problems with this primacy of testing in our public schools, is that it doesn't allow for that kind of like letting go of that fear of what happens when you give the power to the students.
I'm reminded of experiences I've had teaching Harkness style pedagogy around a round table and sort of decentering the sage on the stage model of education, which is so prevalent, and seeing students as co-creators of the direction and just of a discussion of a given class.
And well, I'll just say that one of the things that's at play here, just like name it, is that like we have a deeply ingrained fear of the wildness. Like we're scared of the wildness. And I think that we have to understand that this informs the way that we've dealt with, and when I say we, I mean sort of like kind of industrial capitalist civilization has dealt with wild spaces, has dealt with our natural environment, has dealt with the planet in general. We've attempted to kind of pave everything over because it's scary. It's not controllable. So it's like, let's do things to control it. And ultimately that's done a lot of harm. And I think you can use that same kind of thinking if you think about what we do with children. Children are also symbolically and literally kind of wild, right? So it's like, it can be scary to say, I'm going to give all this control over to, I'm thinking of like my 7-year-old right now. Like it can be scary to like let her make all her own choices, but the way that we really learn ultimately is to, with some guidance, with some care, obviously, and with some parameters. The establishment of a classroom is while a classroom can and should be a creative space, I want to point out that we also do create symbolic and literal parameters to keep things safe. You know what I mean? So it's not just a kind of, free for all situation. There are parameters, there are, guidelines, there are kind of like choices within a certain range of possibilities that we can give, so there's it's not total letting go, but there's a lot of letting go that ought to happen, certainly more than happens typically, I think.
I see that element of control in so many educational structures. And I was really struck by the way you compare the contemporary classroom in the US, at least, very much to the factory, the prison, and the free market, which in a lot of ways has this common thread of kind of flattening creativity, flattening wildness, seeking to control learners toward measured learning outcomes, desired ends. And it occurs to me that many of the problems we're facing, the poly crisis of climate change and species loss, pollution, systemic racism, income inequality, many of these problems require new, creative, imaginative ways of thinking that sort of outmoded ways of thinking no longer suit. Like, for instance, in addressing climate change, just approaching the issue from only a scientific or only a political lens is insufficient to address the complexity of the issue. So I'm really struck by allowing students to kind of weave together these different ways of knowing and to become co-creators of this uncertain world they're entering into.
Yeah. So there are a few different ways to think about this, and those three metaphors you described are kind of how when we talk about the classroom as a metaphor for the world, we're doing that whether we're conscious of it or not. And I think the unconscious metaphors that we're using in our classrooms today, I use those three examples of the free market, which is kind of like, that's what we talk about when we talk about like, race to the top. And it's like this kind of competition between the individuals in there. And like, we need more kind of like this kind of rigorous testing. And then the factory is what I describe my own high school as, right? Like, it's the conveyor belt and you're depositing information in people, and then they kind of move on to the next thing, and the prison is particularly prevalent when you have kind of marginalized communities, and you talk about like, and this is something I've seen over and over again, is this way of thinking about children who are from marginalized communities is requiring more discipline, requiring more rigidity, requiring more control, and that the purpose is to get out. It's a very kind of Augustinian fall redemption sort of notion. It's the idea is that we're trying to get out of it, of this community, and a few chosen individuals become successful, right? And then the rest are sort of like managed and controlled as best we can. And it's like, and I think it's very much, and very much demonstrates kind of the way we think when we think of the world as a machine, something to be controlled, as in that metaphor, or we think of the world to think of the free market metaphor, we think of the world as and I'm thinking of climate change and all these examples, right? We think of the world as like resources, or like we look at a tree and see its ability to to make money for us. And we, and then in the sort of prison metaphor, we simply see the world as somehow unreal or not of value to us in the same way spiritually, sort of dualism, right? This sort of dualism of matter and spirit. And I think that's all of those kind of like symbolic lenses are the ways we've structured our schools, and they've informed kind of the broader civilizational patterns that have led to, for example, the climate crisis. I think that the way out of those crises are in all with the thread that goes through all of those metaphors. I'll say this is the thread of hyper individualism and competition, and the alternatives, I think, more kind of relationally. And I think until we can do that, we won't have the kind of creative thinkers and alternative ideas that you're suggesting we need.
As we approach the end of this episode, Theodore, to talk a little bit about your hope for how this book is received, and how can educators in diverse educational contexts, some of whom have great autonomy over their learning spaces, some of whom are in, as you mentioned, very bureaucratic, very demanding educational contexts, how can they adapt some of the theories and practices from this book?
Yeah, I mean, and it's I think I mentioned earlier when I was talking to my daughter, her experience with remote learning, and how it wasn't like the teachers weren't doing a good job. They were trying really hard. They were doing this, but their hands were tied to some extent by the structure that they were given and different requirements that were expected of them. So I'm aware that it's really a challenge to kind of navigate the expectations of certain school settings. I'd like for anyone who's dealing with young people, whether as a teacher or as a mentor or as a as a parent, whatever you're doing, I think what I'd like more than anything is for people to begin to become aware of the kind of space that, or the importance of cultivating a certain kind of space is, and a certain kind of processes is. In other words, recognizing that they are creating a metaphor for the world in whatever space they're working in. Just knowing that, having awareness of that. What am I teaching without saying it here? You know what I mean? Like that kind of awareness, I think, is the first thing. And I think there are ways of communicating and ways of kind of thinking about how to structure a space, I think, that can be really useful for people. And what happens next in terms of like curriculum and specific things that are taught, to me, is much less important than how we think about the space itself, how we think about the process, meaning the interactions. You know what I mean? For example, like, do I begin? Now, I know that we're limited in many ways depending on the classroom that we're in, but what we can all do is we can all start by asking a question rather than giving a statement, for example. You know what I mean? Like, that's like a minor thing, but I think it completely shifts the energy of a learning space if we start with that. You know, and that's like just a small example of something someone can do if we start thinking differently. But I think cultivating awareness, because I think education is one of the kind of core ways in which our cosmology plays out in the world, in our systems. You know what I mean? I would add like kind of economics to that, or other things, right? That where this cosmology that we talk about, how it actually plays out and affects people in real ways. And what's so important about education is not only is it affected by that cosmology, it actually is one of the primary ways in which that cosmology then is enacted in the world, in which someone actually learns that cosmology and then goes out and acts in the world in all these different arenas. So I think that cultivating an awareness of that cosmology and how it looks in an actual classroom, I think if people can do that, I actually have a lot of trust in educators, that educators mostly care about students and have a lot of skills and knowledge to do things. I think that becoming more aware of the kind of subtle metaphors that are happening can change a lot.
Absolutely. And it comes back to this common thread you bring throughout the book of mindfulness, of being aware of what we're doing, why we're doing it, bringing kids into the present moment, teaching them contemplative practices to cope with depression, anxiety, distraction, the being inundated with information, and helping kids to mindfully inhabit their world. As we come to a close here, Theodore, I'm curious if there's anything else you'd like to share with our global audience here with the Journey of the Universe project. From your life, from the work you're doing, what parting message would you like to leave with our viewers?
Well, I think that, I'd like to say too that when you mentioned mindfulness, I thought about the importance of modeling. I think that the importance of modeling how to be more aware will help young people become more aware. I think the importance of modeling how to be vulnerable will help young people understand it's okay to be vulnerable. I think the notion of modeling how to be a more kind of caring, loving person will help young people do that. And I think that what I'd like to say more broadly is that if we really want to dig into kind of what it is, well, if we talk a lot about like what we don't want the kind of cosmology and the learning space to look like. I think that the most important thing we can do is create a culture of care, where if we can teach people to be that the most significant thing in a learning space is actually to create a culture in which people actually care about each other. And in that space, learn then that they are worthy of love and that they're capable of giving love. And if you can do that, if you can create a community like that, I think actually you'll find that all the other subject matter is a lot easier to teach if people lift each other up and take care of each other. And we think of learning as a shared relational communal effort rather than something that happens only for individuals, So I think that is kind of the core thing that we can all kind of shift toward.
Beautifully said. And that learning should be joyous, as you're mentioning, and something that kids love to do. It's a lifelong process. And in that spirit, I'm so grateful to be learning from you, Theodore. So grateful that for all of your mentorship in this integral education group that we both participate in. And I'm really inspired by the life and educational vision that you're bringing forth. So thank you so much for joining us. Again, Reimagining the Classroom will be available in bookstores on December 8th. And I'm really excited to see the afterlives of this book. So thank you so much, Theodore. And I'm wishing you well for all of your work to come.
Thank you, Sam.